Hey guys, welcome to another edition of Inside the FLX. Our program this hour featured a conversation with Peter Mantius, the founder of The Waterfront. It's an online blog dedicated to covering environmental politics here in the Finger Lakes, and he's been on the program many times. You can see his work here on fingerlakes1.com. Simply click on the Waterfront tab on our homepage. We spent about 35-40 minutes talking about the Incinerator, a controversial local gun club, a manure lagoon in Mence, and of course blue-green algae, which we've seen plenty of reporting on here in the Finger Lakes. Before we get to that conversation, though, don't forget, Inside the FLX is available on iTunes as a podcast and airs weekly on Spectrum, channel 1304, WDWN 89.1 FM, and on FO1 radio. So, Peter, thanks for being here today. Obviously, we have a lot of environmental headlines to get across and to talk about, but the latest with this battle between Assembly Democrats and the future of a $365 million incinerator. Walk us through what's going on right now with that.
Well, one interesting development is that Joe Morelle, who is the majority leader of the state assembly and is running for Congress, wrote a letter to the siting board that will potentially decide the fate of the incinerator. He wrote a letter on September 10th, basically urging the 5 members of that state board to deny the permit. Now, Circular Energy, that they're the company that's proposed the incinerator, they haven't even actually applied to the siting board for this permit yet, but they've started the preliminary proceedings to do that, and it's presumed that they are going to go ahead and follow through. So the fact that Morelle has written a letter urging them that when they get the application to deny it is really interesting. But what's also interesting has been the reaction of the activists who are sort of the point people in the region-wide negative reaction to the proposal. Instead of really congratulating Morelle for taking that action of writing that letter, they've said you're not doing anywhere near enough, and that is potentially just window dressing. What you really should be doing if you want to stop the project is actually make sure that the assembly is called back into session this year to pass a very popular bill that would ban trash incinerators in the Finger Lakes. Now, that bill has already unanimously passed the Senate, and it was poised to be approved by the Assembly on the closing days of the session early in the summer, but it was never called for a vote in the Assembly. And it was said at the time that it got tangled up in a downstate bill that had to do with cameras that would detect speeders in school areas. And some people kind of raised their eyebrows about whether that actually happened that way, or that was just a pretext, a way to kill the bill. And I think that some people were cynical because the individual who is tied to the property where the incinerator would be built has been a major contributor to particularly Governor Cuomo, but also more recently he and his wife have also contributed to Joe Morelle. So there's some suspicion that that either Cuomo or Morelle or both might have had something to do with this not being called for a vote. And so the activists are saying, well, you could clear all that up, Joe, by just simply insisting on having the assembly come back into session briefly before December to vote on the bill, and it would be a slam dunk. It would go right on through, and presumably the governor would sign it. Now, Morelle, I talked to someone on Morelle's staff, and they said, well, it's not quite that easy. Morelle can't just push a button and have the assembly come back. It's really the Speaker of the Assembly, Carl Hastie, who would be the one who would actually have to do that. And so, does Morelle have the influence to get that done? That's certainly debatable. Now the activists are saying, "Oh, come on! Of course he has the influence to do it. He could do it easily. He's just choosing not to do it." So they're being pretty aggressive about trying to say, Joe, we really want to see you take this extraordinary action to show that you truly are against the incinerator. So that's, I think, where that stands right now.
And how frequently, for those, a little bit of context, how often does a callback happen? I'm sure that the exact numbers, we don't have them in front of us now, but that alone is pretty rare, no?
It is. It's I don't have the statistics in my head, but it is. I think it's not common, but it's also not all that difficult to do. I mean, it certainly could be done, and it could be done very briefly. And I also understand, although I don't have any details on this, but I understand that there's some other sort of loose ends that both parties would kind of like to get taken care of in a quick special session. I think there's some downstate issues that they would like to take care of. So you could kill more than one bird with that stone if you did it.
Right. Now, part of this, obviously, there's a little bit of layer of, or at least suspicion of, Albany corruption contributing to, or at least this deadlock nature of politics in Albany, contributing to the standstill that we're at right now. And probably because of that, some folks are saying, especially those on the political side, they're likely saying something along the lines of, well, we can do it next session. We can do it next year. Why are the activists not accepting that as a possibility and continuing to focus on let's get this done now and not wait?
Well, yeah, one of the problems with having it just go on for years and years, this is certainly what happened with Crestwood down at the other end of the lake with the gas storage project that went on for 8 years. And I think the activists say, hey, you have to maintain pressure, political pressure, PR pressure, legal pressure over a long period of time. That involves a lot of commitment, a lot of expense. Somebody's got to pay the lawyers unless you get pro bono help. You have to pay expert witnesses. There are a lot of issues if you drag it out. Will Olewine, who is one of the winery folks who's very against the incinerator, he says, you drag it out, and then you have no incinerator yard signs all over the region. He said that doesn't help anybody. Just if we're going to kill this thing, let's kill it, is his point. And that why let this thing drag on? But on the other hand, I think there will be forces, particularly downstate forces, that are going to come into play on this, or easily could come into play, because New York City does need to do something with its trash. I mean, that's just a fact that we all have to accept. The question is, will it come to the Finger Lakes? And the second question is, if it does come to the Finger Lakes, will it be incinerated or will it be landfilled? And these are all, separate political questions.
Now, one of the interesting things that the last time Assembly Minority Leader Brian Kolb was on this program, late spring, he said, they were working with or talking with the developers to push in a different direction, to go with a different type of project or proposal. Is that sort of taking away from what really the focus should be in killing this project, when you have some elected leaders sort of taking the whole conversation in another direction completely, it seems?
Well, I think it's a valid issue. I mean, I think that the activists up here would love to kill this project and sort of say, okay, that's it, we slam the door, that's sort of end of story. But it's not really the end of story for New York City, which has to deal with this issue. Somebody is going to have to come up with a political alternative on what to do with New York City's trash. If it's not coming to the Finger Lakes, then it's got to go downstate, and that's going to be a really heavy lift for somebody downstate to get anything, whether it's an incinerator or a landfill, sited downstate. That'll be very difficult to do. So, I wouldn't really necessarily criticize politicians that are trying to come up with okay, if we don't do this, what do we do? I'm not sure I would really necessarily criticize that. I would certainly want to know more before going after anybody on that.
So another one of the big environmental stories that obviously has been featured on the waterfront, the EPA and the DEC have shied away from ordering a ceasefire over a gun club that is located near or on Salmon Creek. Walk us through what that story is all about and why that's important.
Sure. All right. Well, okay, there's a gun club in Lansing, a few miles north of Ithaca. It is located in a bend in Salmon Creek, which is one of the main tributaries to Cayuga Lake. And it's been there for a long time. It's been there since, I think, the 50s. It's probably got somewhere between 100 and 150 members. It has a clubhouse. They have a lot of barbecues there, horseshoe throwing. They do a lot of things, but they have a couple of they do the skeet shooting, and they have a rifle range and a pistol range. And the problem is, at least from the EPA's standpoint, the Environmental Protection Agency, the federal agency, is that they are shooting over Salmon Creek and over wetlands. And that is a clear violation of federal law. And as a result of that, it'd been going on for years. I mean, even to the point where the gun club had been depositing literally tons of lead in the creek wetland area. Tons of lead over the years, and maybe even more than a ton a year. So we're talking about a lot of lead going into this tributary to Cayuga Lake. So some local people who had seen this going on forever, and by the way, there are probably a half a dozen other gun clubs in Tompkins County. So this is not just attacking a gun club because it's got a gun club. It's attacking a gun club because it's shooting over a tributary to Cayuga Lake. Anyway, some folks there in Lansing were very upset about it, and they went to the EPA and said, hey, you guys are supposed to regulate this. So in 2016, there was a formal consent agreement between the EPA and the gun club. And basically the EPA said, you guys have 180 days to stop shooting lead. You can just flat out stop shooting lead, or you can reorient your shooting ranges so you're not shooting over the little stream. And the gun club basically opted for the second one. But unfortunately, the deadline for complying with that expired earlier this year. And so the gun club never really did quite reorient the shooting ranges. And then in June, they had a law firm come in and say that, well, actually, we don't really need to comply with any kind of local rules about how we reorient our fields of fire. And so they just started with the bulldozers, and they were making some changes in the site, and it wasn't really exactly clear what they were going to do. But the town finally stepped in and said, well, you're not allowed to do that, and they issued a stop work order. And I may not be totally up to date on this, but I believe that everything has stopped over there right now, at least temporarily.
Mm-hmm. Now, as far as this story goes, it seems like this is another example where we're talking about the DEC or EPA being a little bit behind, maybe not quite having the staff to keep up on something. It seems to be that a lot of these environmental stories, when it comes to the checks and balances at the state level and then above, it ultimately comes down to staffing on whether it's happening at an appropriate level or not. Is that a real part of this storyline?
I mean, that's part of it. Yeah, I mean, it's also, like in baseball, and there's a pop fly, and there are two outfielders that could get it, and it's like, I got it, you take it, kind of thing, and nobody knows who should have the authority. And in this case, the DEC is saying, well, the EPA has an active, consent agreement here. We're not going to come in and launch our own, enforcement action, in the face of that. It's kind of up to the EPA to, follow through on what they've already started. So you can somewhat understand that. Everybody's trying to figure out who needs to clamp down here, and there is, we don't know how it's going to turn out.
Right. Now, part of that, just part of me is then asking, well, then what should residents expect? What is the expectation, or what is the pulse of the folks in that area, in that community, for what they think will happen over, say, the next year to two?
I mean, I think they don't know whether there will be any kind of enforcement applied, because there hasn't been for a long, long time. Remember, it was the residents who went to the EPA and knocked on the door and said, "Hey, would you mind enforcing the law?" And they did, and they did a consent agreement, but they just have not followed up on it and have not enforced it. And I don't know how much of that has to do with the change in administration. I don't really know if the NRA is behind the scenes in any of this. There was a new law firm that came in, and who's paying them? I don't know. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of unanswered questions. There's some suspicions, but at this point, I haven't seen enough evidence to really go at that.
So, what's going on in Schuyler County? There was a story earlier in the summer about torrential rains continuing to threaten the county, even though some improvements have been made. Walk us through what's happening on that front and where that sort of leaves the county now.
Sure. Well, as I think it was pretty well reported, Watkins, after the big rain event, or there have been several big rain events, but after one of the big rain events, Watkins had a ban on drinking its tap water for 9 days.
Right.
And I think a lot of people presumed that things like that would not happen anymore after the new water treatment plant is completed in Watkins. It's now in the early stages of construction along Catherine Creek. And this is a new water treatment plant that is going to serve both Watkins Glen and Montour Falls. Both towns have very antiquated ones that really need some help, and so the towns got together and combined, and I think it's a really good move. They're building this new facility. Now the location may not be the greatest, but it is very good that they're doing the work. The problem though is that there still may be problems with tap water when there are major rain events like this, because what happens is the turbidity of the lake, which is where all the water comes from, there's nothing you can do about that. And the water treatment plant cannot really stop that situation from happening. So we may still have these kind of problems with no, you have to boil your water when this happens. It may still happen.
And that might be a surprise, especially given for some residents the price tag of the work itself. $30 million, you said, correct?
Right, and it is affecting rates. I'm sorry I don't have those the specific numbers on that, but it is definitely affecting the charge for sewer.
Does this speak to the need to look at things like turbidity or these other issues that may have slipped through the cracks during the planning process of this facility?
Well, or
is it a separate issue in and of itself?
I think it's a separate issue. I really do. I think that the towns are definitely doing the right thing to build a new plant, because you do want to be able to handle your basically your sewage. It's another issue, though, protecting your sewage treatment system from being just overwhelmed by flooding that comes down off the hills in a heavy rain. I think if we have more of these heavy rain events, we're just going to see more of it, more problems, because it's very hard to protect the sewer system from the stormwater system. They're working on it. In fact, both towns have spent money trying to protect the sewer system from the stormwater system, but it's going to take a lot more work.
All right, well, we're going to take a quick break from local sponsor, and then we will be back, and we're going to talk about something that everyone's been hearing about, HABs, blue-green algae, and the Finger Lakes here, and what's going on with that, as well as a little interesting story about CAFOs. So more on that when we come back in just about a minute.
I was severely injured. I was on a ventilator. My husband was scared, and he just went for the nearest number that he had heard advertised over and over and figured they're the best. They know what they're doing. I think that's the typical reaction, but unfortunately, it wasn't the right one. And I'm thankful that we learned that early on in the process. He decided to look for someone locally who would give us a little more personalized attention. And when we met Steve and talked with him, we knew that we had found that person. If you want to feel like you have an attorney who's in your corner, who's going to listen to you, who's going to endeavor to understand you, give Steve a call. I really felt like everyone at Madej, Mears, and Rickey really cared.
For a law firm that cares about you, contact Madej, Mears, and Rickey at 315-568-0911. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome.
All right, and welcome back to the program. We have Peter Mantius of the Waterfront in studio today. He's talking to us about the latest local headlines in the environmental and political space. CAFOs and the DEC. CAFOs are one of those things that a lot of folks have probably heard about. They may not completely understand what a CAFO is or how it's contributing to the environmental side of the Finger Lakes, or that news side of the Finger Lakes. So walk us through what that is, and then also the most recent story that you published. Really interesting look at one farm in particular. Walk us through it.
Sure. Well, CAFOs are, let's see, I think it's concentrated animal feeding operations. I think that's right. And these are basically the large, really mostly large dairy farms, at least in this area. And there are several hundred of them in New York State. In April, a Supreme Court judge in Albany said that the DEC was not following the law and regulating this, and ordered them to come up with new rules for basically managing and regulating CAFOs. Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that I've learned in the last few days is that apparently they have come up with draft new rules. I think earlier this month they issued the draft, and it's now a comment period on the draft. Apparently the new rules only apply to 21 of the CAFOs, even though there are several hundred out there, and it gets to be a fairly arcane distinction as to what the DEC's definition is of why the rules apply to some CAFOs and not others. To probably oversimplify, the CAFOs that actually drain into a water body and need a speedies permit for discharging, it's my understanding that is the basic demarcation between the 21 CAFOs that the new rules will apply to and all the others that don't have to change the rules. So that's going on right now. So the state is in the process of rewriting these rules under a court order to do so. And Riverkeeper has been behind all this. They're the ones that filed the lawsuit that led to the judge's order. And it's my understanding that they believe that the rules should apply to many more CAFOs than what the DEC is standing by at this point. Okay, now the one CAFO or the one situation that I wrote about deals with the little town of Mentz, and there is a very large manure lagoon that is under construction.
There's probably a few people who are listening right now saying, "What is a manure lagoon? What is that?"
Basically, CAFOs and the cows that live in the CAFOs produce a lot of manure, really a lot of manure, and it has to be stored somewhere. And these lagoons, there are a number of them around the state. this would be an extremely large one. And there are some folks in the little town of Mentz who are concerned that there's been virtually no regulatory oversight as to the construction of this lagoon. And it turns out that the permitting of the lagoon, there were some questions about that because it was it involved a California company as well as a very prominent dairy farm, the Horrigan Dairy Farm that supplies Burn Dairy and others. They're also involved in it. So it's another sort of cloudy regulatory situation as to whether they've gotten the proper permits to build this lagoon. So that's a story that I focused on. Now, interestingly, the Horrigans, even though they have a very, very large dairy operation, I do not believe that they are on that list of 21 that would be affected by the rules changes. So I have to do a lot more reporting on this to figure out, okay, now, who and why? Why are the new rules not applying to certain people but applying to others? And is that appropriate?
Now, obviously, for those who have heard about CAFOs, they probably have heard it as part of a discussion about blue-green algae and toxic algae and HABs, because it is from time to time one of those items that pops up. Obviously, there has been a lot of news in the HAB realm. Virtually every lake has had some sort of algae bloom reported on it in the last, say, month and a half, usually from early August through like late September is that sort of sweet spot. Right. But where do we stand right now with the reports and then also the actual underreporting? We were talking a little bit before we came on here about how there's an underreporting element at play here too, right?
Well, first I'll start off by giving sort of a shout out to Tom Wilbur of Gannett, who's a very, very good reporter on the environment, who wrote a really in-depth piece on the link between CAFOs and toxic algae in the Finger Lakes and really everywhere. And very good story. CAFOs, because they produce nitrogen and phosphorus. If manure is spread on fields that washes into the lakes, it basically becomes fuel for toxic algae. And CAFOs seem to be one of the main violators here, but the degree to which we're still trying to figure it out, and the scientists are trying to figure it out. So I think right now what's important is monitoring. I mean, for the people who swim in the lakes and even drink and use the lake water, how much do they need to be worried about toxic algae? And it's the DEC does a good job with a HABs notification page where they list all of the water bodies in the state that have had problems with toxic algae. But I've noticed in the last few days that that page seems to be either underreporting the most serious events or they're lagging. For example, Seneca Lake is monitored very closely by Seneca Lake Pure Waters. They've found many instances of confirmed algae blooms, many of them, I'd say, certainly more than a dozen. But in 4 cases, there are situations where there are high toxins, which is the most dangerous kind of algae bloom. 4 cases, Geneva, Dresden, Lodi, and a place up on the northeast corner of Seneca Lake. Now, those have been identified and lab confirmed high toxins, and yet they do not appear on the DEC page. There's no notification there saying that Seneca Lake has been afflicted with high toxins. And they do have that specific designation. They just have not applied it to Seneca Lake. Cayuga seems to be even even worse, because also the DEC is not identifying Cayuga as a lake that has been hit by high toxins. But I was just on the website of the Community Science Institute this morning. They're based in Ithaca. They do a very good job of testing themselves, but they also send out to a DEC lab to have it confirmed. In looking at their stats, I found 19 cases of high toxins, almost all in September, on Cayuga Lake. Now again, the DEC, their notification page does not even mention high toxins for Cayuga Lake. But this is 19 cases, and of those 19 cases, I believe it was 8 of them were at least 10 times the DEC's threshold for high toxins. So either the DEC is just flat underreporting or they're behind the curve, one or the other. In any case, I think if you live on one of the lakes, you need to go to the website that for the local lakes that provide the more detailed information.
Does this make the case pretty simple for the folks who've been saying each lake should have its own sort of watchdog system in place to make sure that that lake is being reported on properly?
Definitely.
Now, what does this also? There's the element of the state is involved in this issue. So last year, $65 million, I believe, was dedicated to studying the HAB problem across the state. Some of the Finger Lakes were included, others were not. What have you heard in terms of where this study stands and what progress is sort of happening within it? And this problem that you've noticed with the DEC reporting, is that cause for concern about what studying the state may be doing?
Well, I hope that the DEC figures out a more comprehensive way to report these outbreaks, because it is useful to know whether a lake has been hit by toxic algae, but if say it's Seneca or Cayuga, you really need to know more specific information. Where on the lake, very specifically. That's where it's important to go to sources like Seneca Lake Pure Waters Association, which has a website, and it has an interactive map where you can, if you have a cottage somewhere, you can zero right in on it and find out if there have been any kind of suspected or confirmed with high toxin situations near your place. Mm-hmm. You can't do that at the DEC level, and maybe the DEC should think about doing that. I don't want to, I don't know what the cost would be involved there. Right. Maybe what the DEC needs to do is for each lake provide a website or an interactive map for that situation, so people can actually use the information in a more practical way.
Is that as you report on this and talk to folks and hear what people are saying, and obviously you live here in the Finger Lakes, so this is personal for you too. Is it tough sometimes to keep up with the blooms and outbreaks as they pop up? Because it does seem like once you hit the beginning of August, it's 2 to 3 times a week, and I can speak from experience here at Finger Lakes 1. I know for a fact we've missed some of them just because of how many are constantly coming out and being published in one way or another.
I don't feel the DEC has a really hard task, because not only are these things popping up all the time, but they're also disappearing all the time. Mm-hmm. So it's really, really hard to maintain a website that covers the whole state. It's geographically so diverse, and also just the timing of these things. These things can last for maybe 3 days and then they're gone. Right. So it's very hard to keep track of it all. And that's why I think, getting back to your question about individual lake monitors, I think that's a really good idea. And I think the interactive maps that several of the lakes have right now, where you can go on there and really zero in on a specific bay, that's really helpful. I think there are 4 of the Finger Lakes that have those now. I think Owasco does. I believe Canandaigua also have interactive maps. Seneca and Cayuga obviously do. Mm-hmm.
Now, do you think, in terms of coverage, you've done a great job of keeping on top of this issue. Do you think folks who live out there should, or live in the Finger Lakes, should they feel good about the progress that's being made, or should they still be pretty concerned about the rate of appeared increase every year and more blooms?
No, they should be very concerned, because I think that the identification of the problem has been slow and not really adequate, given how dangerous it is. And I think that people really should be on alert. I mean, I swim in Seneca Lake all the time, but I'm always kind of, depending on what kind of day it is. If it's a really warm, calm day late in the summer, I'm definitely looking to see the little wisps in the lake water to see if there's anything there, because you really don't want to be swimming in it.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, your reporting has been featured on FingerLakes1.com for several months now. But where can folks find you? Where can folks read the great stuff that you are putting out really quite frequently?
Well, I'm trying to think of the exact web address. It's a little bit difficult to remember it exactly.
Well, on our network, it's FingerLakes1.com/waterfront. But your blog, where all of that is actually housed, is the Waterfront Online?
Waterfrontonline.blog.
Yep.
And sometimes I'm not sure whether that comes up if you Google it and then Google my name. It will. Mm-hmm. If you do my name and Waterfront, Mantius and Waterfront, it'll definitely come up.
All right. Well, really appreciate you